You mentioned Dave Sackett. Now, he was that Mac, and I think there may be a few of us here who've at least been in a room with David Sackett. And he was very, in some weird way, toward the end of his career, somewhat almost apologetic. And I'd heard rumors that he had said that he wished people hadn't become so dogmatic about clinical trials the way things became. It's almost like it became so strong an area. I was indoctrinated, and Mark, you know this, I was indoctrinated with Gordon Guyatt, the professor there, who was very much at the time, level 1 evidence was about clinical trials. So we were going to do clinical trials. But I can tell you on a personal note, every time we've done a trial, and we've done lots together, Mark, you think you spend several years, lots of money, and ultimately you get a really marginal difference, and you start questioning, could we have used those resources in a different way? Now, you learn a lot from doing so, but I have actually warmed a lot more towards non-RCT data for a couple of reasons. And I'm going to throw it out to everyone else. And if I could, those of you who feel comfortable coming on video, please do. It makes it, it'll just make it easier for us to connect. And if you have a question, we'll be able to flag it that way. But this is a conversation. And the thing that I would say that I've become very, very aware of has been the real danger of small randomized trials. And we've talked a lot about this. And, I'm sure over the history, JBJS has published lots of trials, and, trials get published because they're an RCT and they preferentially get put through the system. But small trials are very, very dangerous because people will believe a small, not so well conducted study that may be full of holes, and they'll ignore a massive observational data set that may have been meticulously collected. And that has been sort of the, in my own mind, sort of the shift of where we have to go. So we've been moving towards looking at large data sets as well. I want to get other people involved if I could, just around the issue. How many of you feel, you don't have to say strongly or not, but how many of you feel that we aren't publishing or that it's harder to get non-RCTs published? Because that's an issue. I think there's a sense of sometimes you think, well, if I say it's randomized, not to say that you should be lying that it's not randomized, but a randomized trial, even if it's 50 patients, is going to have a much, much better pathway to a publication than a non-randomized. And that may be some of the challenges people are feeling. I'm curious what people's experiences are with just different forms of evidence.
Well, I'm always taken back to one of my fellowship mentors, Charles Gore Brown, and I'm always taken back to, when he was published, they've published extensively, but he published a series of 1,100 of their tibial nails with data meticulously collected, prospect, all that sort of stuff. And it gave us some good information around, tibial nailing. I mean, who else has 1,100 of them that they published as a series? And that's when he, and I always reflect back when I hear him pontificate about some, as you said, some smaller RCTs, and he said, well, we knew that already. We knew that already. Based on what you're talking about, Professor Swiatkowski, about experience. So I don't know, I reflect on that. And the other thing that I reflect on is the fact that some of these randomized trials are showing these no differences, and you have to ask yourself, are we asking the right questions? And so anyway, I don't have anything major to say, but I have those reflections that are speaking to you, and that there's certainly some power in 1,100 tibial nails that you've done to report on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not disagreeing. Is there anyone else who has an experience that you'd like to share? I mean, we're talking evidence, so really anything goes here, and you're here with the editor, so it's a good opportunity. It's a good opportunity, and if you want to pitch a study, he's right there. He's right there. Can't guarantee publication. That's a disclaimer. But anyways.
So I work in the field of chronic pain, and we've done a couple of, the lab that I work with has done a couple of RCTs, small RCTs, and the data is like how we all just explained it is. But a couple of the trials, what we ended up doing was we added a qualitative piece where we ended the trial and had I guess like an exit interview with the participants. And the information that we ended up gleaming from that conversation itself was so rich and much more meaningful to the patients and to the researchers themselves about what could be, what could be enhanced for future trials. But unfortunately, those types of papers aren't just getting published. So you're stuck between this need to want to publish and whatever that means to you as a researcher, and then as a researcher clinician, you're also wanting to have meaningful interactions with your patients, and really you want them to be feeling better, and the publications can matter later. But yeah, that's just my own experience.
Well, maybe I'll ask a very direct question then to you, Dr. Swiankowski, which is, when you look at the review process, obviously, all processes are aimed to be as free of any sort of overt bias as possible, and every journal tries to go through that process. But do you feel that there is an easier pathway for a particular study design? And if there is, how have you at the JBJS tried to mitigate that? It sounds like you're very open to saying, listen, we're accepting all types of, and we're valuing them. It seems to be with equal, well, maybe not equal merit, but close to equal merit. And is that truly true? Because if you get an RCT, the immediate perception is that's going to be, it's going to have a much easier pathway to publication, assuming it's done reasonably well, kind of thing.
Right. So JBJS has been around for 130 some years, and we have the advantage of a lot of very experienced individuals willing to participate as reviewers and as deputy editors. We practice rigorous double blinding so that the reviewers can't easily, they can if they know the field quite well, oftentimes know where the manuscript is coming from, but it's not easy. And in the same way, the other way around, the authors won't know who the reviewers are. Our acceptance rate hovers around 18%. It's drifting lower. And we actually, we just had a workshop last night where we reviewed 7 manuscripts. Workshops are done when the decision is contested, or when we have disparate reviews. We'll have an A review, a B review, and a C review, then they go to a workshop. But 2 of the 7 last night were RCTs, and neither of them were accepted for publication. And it was because one of them, the reason was that the trial took some 12 years to conduct, and during that time, the whole shift from one of the treatments has gone away as education and surgical skills has improved. So it was basically deemed irrelevant, as well as a lot of confounders that happened. But just because you have an RCT doesn't guarantee publication by any shake in the journal. Qualitative research, as you brought up, sorry, I can't see your name on the screen, but it is difficult to get qualitative research published. Not so difficult if you're in the sociologic literature or other related fields to medicine. And it's our struggle there is to get reviewers that actually understand its value, to be quite honest. We have published some qualitative research. We also have aspects of a section we call the JBJS Forum, where the qualification in terms of the soundness of the data is not so high. So we do consider these, but to be honest, my struggle is finding reviewers that understand its value.
Anyone have any experiences you'd like to share, any issues with the questions? While you're doing that, I think I wouldn't mind asking, I mean, we've all been through a pretty unique period, and we're still going through, I think the US is still going through it in the last 4 weeks, but you've had to adapt rapidly, as we all have, journals especially. And there have been some, really amazing things that have come out of getting information out quickly, but you've also, I'm sure, are well aware of some of the challenges that have happened with 2 major retractions off of a couple of journals recently, showing that, getting things out quickly is good, getting things out quickly may also be problematic, and because some of the safeguards. And I've said this a lot, people have probably heard this, but Johnny Anutis was one of the Stanford professors, epidemiologist, who's been speaking about this for decades around the risk, right? The hot topic risk. And if we're chasing a hot topic, we're going to get ourselves into problems, and people tend to rush. And COVID is probably a classic. I mean, it is really a prototypical classic example of everyone jumping in with all might, all resource, and opening all the floodgates to get things in fast. I wonder if you might be able to reflect on your role at the journal and what decisions you made and how you kind of tried to manage the influx. And I imagine you had thousands of submissions.
Well, not quite 1,000. It was some. I actually have the spreadsheet on my desktop. It's somewhere around 450 submissions, of which I believe we ended up publishing around 50.
Yes.
50 or so. We tried to use the experience of the centers that had the first wave. So we had submissions that we published from Wuhan, and then from Italy, and then from Spain, and then Germany, and how well they had done. And we basically, obviously, we had to go with short-term follow-up. We had to go with data sets that weren't actually, subject to a lot of scrutiny, not a lot of validation. But we were struggling to try to get information out to the orthopedic community as rapidly as we possibly could. Interestingly enough, that period lasted about 5 weeks. And one of the things we learned was that the field was evolving so rapidly that it was almost futile to publish something without a little more background and thoroughness and information gathering. So I would say in the last 100 submissions, we may have published 3 or 4. And so the bar has gone way up. And I can't conceive of another situation like this happening again in orthopedics. I really can't. It's very, very unusual.
It was. I mean, it's the first time where, so if you were to believe or at least a thought that you're saying you have to be looking at other forms of evidence, right? So we sort of metaphorically or sort of diagrammatically said, well, if you have a first wave of evidence, the first wave of evidence is going to be expert opinion, like right off the bat, right? Or some sort of historical look at something in the back. Early case reports, early data, anything that's a trial or even prospective collection, that's going to come later. And if you're getting it quickly, you're going to be questioning how you're getting it because there's no experience. There's no experience with it. So you really almost can argue that all forms of evidence, especially when evidence is rapidly needed, when there's something happening. No, the argument is, they keep saying, or when they say the WHO says, this is the beginning of another one. There's going to be something else. Maybe it's not COVID, it'll be something else. And we better learn from this in a way. What do you think the journals are going to learn about adapting to this? Because I'm sure there's probably been, if you look back, lots of things that you would have maybe shifted. Or are there efficiencies you suddenly saw you can use that you'll keep now? There's probably a bit of both happening, I imagine.
Right. So one of the great benefits that was just fortuitous is I have a patient that I took care of for a calcaneus fracture. His name's Mike Osterholm, he's one of the world's leading epidemiologists in viral transmission. So in order to make sure that we weren't publishing anything that was off the wall, Mike was kind enough to review stuff and basically pass so that we didn't publish anything that was just wrong. So that was totally, I don't know how he happened to be my patient. And he always said, if you need anything, just give me a call. So I said, Mike, I need something. So he was looking at manuscripts at 2 a.m. For us for a long period of time. The thing that we have learned is that you can in fact get really high quality reviews in 36 hours. And you can get copy editing in another 36 hours. And if you have to, you can get something up in 5 days. Peer reviewed, copy edited, make sure all the numbers add up, tables are good in 5 days. Whether we ever have to use that again, I doubt it.
Yeah,
But it is possible.
Yeah, the one thing that just, you know, like, we'll speak to ortho evidence, the same thing, that we primarily only look at RCT data, right? We've just been publishing reports that are RCT data. And, you know, in good times, and I suspect the same with the JB, just in good times, people kind of look at the journals, they look at the evidence, and they say, okay, good, it's there, it's part of the background, and it's one of the things we look at. But when things get really difficult, people do look to evidence. It's more than ever in the last 4 weeks. So I felt that people, and I'm curious what your perception has been at the journal level of how important evidence has become, because there was so much noise. Like, there was so much noise, and you know, I think people look to trusted sources. So JBJS has been there for decades. It's a trusted source. So I think your COVID center probably had a lot of eyeballs on it, I suspect. And we were working with you very closely. And I think that, so Herman Johal is here. He was, and Carlos Pradas is here. They were, you know, really instrumental together in helping put together these rapid guideline reviews that were just, data was coming up everywhere. But, you know, we would have never had a place to put them, because they're like, you know, 50, 60 page documents, and journals aren't going to publish that. But people were craving it. So I'm just curious what your experience has been with that.
Yeah, the web traffic, I get, and I think it's an avoidance of looking at anything in the popular press or popular media. The web traffic went up something like 350%, and is still up. I couldn't agree more that people really look for the best quality evidence in a time when things really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone have any? I feel like I can talk for hours, folks, but I would love it if anyone else has a question or a comment.
Hi, I will introduce myself. I'm Dr. Joel Boyd. I'm actually partners with Dr. Bond and Dr. Swinkowski.
Hi.
Hey, Joel.
My subspecialty happens to be sports. So when we start talking research, and Mark knows this a little bit, you know, we have a very high level group that's relatively small, and most of what happens at that high level, you know, is really dependent on expert opinion. And when you try to put something together that's a randomized control study, it rarely goes very far, because there's just not enough people, and you have to have buy-in by organizations as well. And I'm just trying to figure out if, and I know Mark and I have had a couple of patients, for example, a couple of femur fractures in professional athletes. And if you look at the big body of literature that says these patients don't do very well in terms of coming back to, you know, laborious, you know, high level jobs or physical jobs, you know, you'd say, you know, these guys had no chance, but yet both guys came back, and one guy was player of the year in the NFL. So it really was a little kind of a different, and that was more of an expert opinion, you'd say, as an outcome. And so I'm just wondering if, you know, if Mark or in JBJS, does he foresee any way that we can do more of that, or figure out how we can do something with smaller patient groups?
Yeah, you know, so I think that's an excellent point, Joel. And I've done nothing but trauma my entire career, 35 years or something like that. And I never would have said that it was possible what those two athletes did. And I think it's really a tribute to the rehabilitation setup that you who work in professional sports have. No patient who's not in that situation is going to have a dedicated trainer there with them 4 to 5 hours a day to optimize that outcome. So yeah, the journal would be interested in populations with common fractures that have the access to this kind of rehabilitation resource that's not accessible anywhere, to see what the outcome is. Not to mention motivation. You and I have talked about that a lot. There's a difference in motivation between the result you get in somebody that's right before a contract year as compared to somebody that just signed a 3-year contract. I mean, the whole psychological motivation thing is there too. So yeah, from the rehabilitation side, to demonstrate what exactly is possible for some of these severe injuries, absolutely. we'd be interested in. I know AJSM is as well.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there is that point. I mean, if you have the case report or that case, but generally, a high-level athlete, like for example, another classic example is, you know, the early proponents of PRP, where, you know, we had a, you know, elite football player. We put some, you know, PRP in the quads, and the football player did really well. Yeah, they're going to do pretty well, you know, unless you start testing, and then you start testing PRP, and you realize, well, in fact, you know, there may be some other factors associated with it. It may not all just be, you know, this magical PRP. Not to say that there's not potential for it, but that's what it gets back to me. So, like, if you're going to make a big shift in practice, what is likely to make the big shift in practice? So you can make the argument that, okay, for very rare things, we just cannot do an RCT, and that totally makes sense. So you're not going to do an RCT, and you look at some other form of information. But when would the RCT be the appropriate, you know, approved, you know, appropriate design then? You know, if all evidence is considered important, when would we as a group start looking at the RCT as being, well, we should be doing the RCT in this case? My general rule of thumb, if I think about it, is an RCT, you know, reasonably feasible? If it's reasonably feasible, we have to have a pretty compelling reason why we wouldn't try to do that first, you know, unless there's some big barrier to doing it. So if it's a very rare outcome, it's a very complex procedure, or you're just not going to get, you know, acetabular fracture care. We've had arguments for decades about acetabular fracture care, and you can argue reasonably that doing a trial of treatments of acetabular fracture care are going to be fraught with all kinds of potential confounding, because the technical components of it are so important that, you know, it's going to be hard to unpackage that, you know, from the procedure itself. But you can make arguments that, you know, like we have, right? Like putting an irrigation solution into an open wound, A or B, we can probably do that with a reasonable degree of facility. So we've been thinking about how you would do that. And I wonder if there's anyone here who's thought about other approaches to designs. Like, you know, for example, and I don't know if you're getting any of this, Mark, which is using outcome, you know, using already collected outcome data. So making your trials more efficient. The group like Ian Harris, for example, in Australia, has set up a platform he was telling us about, which is they're rapidly recruiting patients in clusters and centers to look at, you know, something where they don't have to collect, because it's sort of a standard of care. So, you know, for a period of a month, to look at one solution, period of next month to look at another solution. Let's say it's for a PrEP solution, for example. But then the outcome data, if it's simple and objective, they're using a registry, that the Australian data registry, to collect it. So they're finding ways to kind of use observational data and RCT to make them very, very simple and easy. Now, I think there's problems potentially with, you know, not getting the best of both, because you try to cut corners on RCT, you cut corner on observational study. That may also be problematic, but the idea seems very interesting and certainly not novel in the sense of no one's ever thought of it. But I wonder if others have been thinking about how to make these things more useful, because the challenge with RCTs has always been they're hard to do and they take forever.
I think just to piggyback on that, thanks for the great talks, Mark and Deb. I really enjoyed that summary. Just to talk about, you know, your experience, Mark, having seen orthopedic research evolve over the time you have, and how have you seen outcomes shift in our priority, and what types of outcomes we say as surgeons are important? And then, you know, what should we, especially now that we've all gone through this, what kind of outcomes do you think we should continue to focus on? Because, you know, the outcome you choose dictates a lot of the mechanics of your trial, the size and whatnot. And oftentimes we'll choose the most convenient one, the easiest one to collect, say piggybacking on some of these databases. But, you know, in that case, we might be doing a study that might not move the needle the way we want to move the needle and have the impact. So, you know, how have you seen outcomes shift over time, and where do you think outcomes, and how do you think outcomes need to be prioritized going forward to have an impact as RCTs and maybe other types of research?
That's a superb question, and it kind of gets to what Mo was just alluding to as well. You know, I was actually, I got onto the editorial board of JBJS because in 1989, I had a career shift where I really got into outcomes assessment and did work to develop and validate an outcome scale for extremity function. So that was 1990. And I was asked to join the editorial board, I think in 92 or 93, as the deputy editor for Outcomes. So we've come a long way since then. There are tons of validated outcomes for just about any kind of common condition you can think of that's disease or condition specific, as well as extremity functional outcomes, etc. There is a move, certainly in the States, in a lot of centers to use patient-reported outcomes to report the results of joint replacement, for example. And there's a particular, I think, movement towards the PROMIS tools, which are constructed so that using a design so that you can limit the number of items that a patient has to respond to. So I foresee a time when we will have those data in our electronic medical record in huge data sets, so that with sophisticated analytic designs, you'll be able to ferret out relevant information, much in the way we've used CMS data or provincial data in Ontario to address questions, but there will be outcomes data there as well. Deb Bone, who presented earlier, has been a part of the effort to try to embed this in our joint replacement practice in a large multi-specialty orthopedic setting. The trick is getting the patients incentivized to do it. And I haven't cracked that nut yet, but my feeling is many insurance companies in the United States incentivize patients to go to the fitness center. They'll get lower premiums or lower copays. And I think a system where you incentivize patients to complete, validated outcomes measured on an annual basis, for example, would provide the kind of data that we can use in massive data sets to do this type of work. I hope that sort of gets at what your question. As far as designing a trial, I think it all depends on the condition, right? I mean, if you're gonna design a trial on two types of intervention for carpal tunnel, there's a specific validated instrument for that, and that's the way you should go. It's quite a different question than trying to use huge cohorts to do sophisticated analyses.
And so just to continue on that discussion, do you think that's still the most, patient-reported outcomes, functional outcomes, we've seen that shift go towards focus on that, but is that still the most relative now? We've gone through this whole experience where orthopedic surgery was shut down, and in a lot of locations, even, Ontario included, we had a hard time getting orthopedics back on the radar to restart, because they would argue that we're a lifestyle specialty, quote unquote, and we focus on functional outcomes. How do we compete against the other, things that healthcare decision makers are going to be looking at now, like, say mortality and maybe length of stay and resource utilization? Like, what is the role of that, say, in future studies?
Well, we have a lot to speak in our favor. Certainly in countries like the U.S., where we have this very inefficient way of paying for healthcare. Orthopedics is a big money specialty, so we win that argument, at least for this time in history. And then we've got the population demographic worldwide that the tsunami, as it's been called, of arthritic conditions in the elderly, and you can tie chronic pain into mental health, and we can make the argument that it's more than just a lifestyle. It really is a quality of life issue, and I think most politicians really understand that. Certainly, that you can go towards their family or their parents or whatever, and most everybody's seen an orthopedic surgeon. It's 40% of primary care visits worldwide. So for musculoskeletal conditions, I'm talking about. So we have a lot to bring to the table.
There's the move, from EBM, and we're always having this debate, and I'm trying to still get my head around value-based healthcare, and we had a discussion on that from Netherlands. Rudolf Poolman, I think someone but
Yep.
They were talking about that. what's your, like, I guess, like I look at, you know, EBM and value-based healthcare is kind of, it's trying to do the same thing, but they have slightly different way of measuring outcomes. I got the impression that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know others here know more about it than I do, but you know, EBM looks at the individual, the outcome on an individual, and it's very individualized for the most part. But value looks at the whole care process. Like if we were to give you a bundled payment of X for this whole patient's care, hip fracture, anyway, from preoperative to you know, to some period of follow-up, use that wisely in a way to figure out where they need it, to individualize it to the whole group. So you got more people, I guess, in silos in EBM, but maybe not so siloed in value-based. Is that a reasonable analogy, or what is the shift, right? Because I know US is very, very big movement, or at least there's proponents of value-based healthcare. I don't know if it's become the only discussion point.
Well, I think it has risen to the top of mind for a lot of high-level administrators that administrate healthcare systems. But there is definite pushback, and not everybody agrees that it's the right way to go, and that includes even some health economists. So you know, there is no doubt in my mind that we are in orthopedics. We waste a lot of resource, particularly in the U.S. You know, and not so much in Canada, but man, I see so many young surgeons using locked distal fibular plates that cost 30 times what a 1/3 tubular plate costs, without any one sliver of evidence that it has anything to do with the patient outcome. We could certainly pay attention more to what things cost to deliver care in the U.S. for sure.
You know, and we just had a conference call before this, or a meeting before this, with PJ Devereaux, who's a cardiologist and perioperative healthcare researcher. And the argument that's being made, it seems to be in a lot of groups, which is we're not likely, and you and I have talked about this, right? We're not likely going to see, if we look at hip fracture care, for example, we've had this discussion, another treatment A versus B is unlikely to solve the problem of hip fractures. And maybe it is an observational study. Maybe it's trying to figure out what other factors, preoperative, intraoperative, and postoperative, might actually be predictive. And it may turn out, as it's seeming, that the surgery is one small part of the overall, you know, outcome source of a patient, and probably it's not the main one. And so it's an interesting dynamic now in seeing that when you're looking at extracting value, we're spending a lot of focus and money on the implants, but maybe that doesn't, well, we've done it. You know how many times we do big trials and they come out, wow, no difference. And we keep shaking our head, right? So, you know, there seems to be a plan of action in that direction. And I think that gets back to, I think, Herman, you were saying, which is, you know, maybe we should be thinking more carefully about the outcomes we're choosing and maybe the costs associated with those outcomes.
Yeah.
Sure. I just have a quick comment around that.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Aisha, hi.
Hello, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself.
No, okay.
So, you know, going back to Herman's comment, and I think, you know, really focusing on the outcomes that you choose. So when thinking about outcomes, I'm thinking about, you know, low frequency outcomes as well as low frequency populations. Both of those factors are really difficult to capture in an RCT. So I think in those situations, we can probably use real world evidence, which has more traction these days in terms of the volume of data. And, you know, recognizing that some things are probably better studied with an RCT compared to an observational study. Maybe there could be an RCT looking at an intervention, but if there is a way to link those patients with existing administrative data sets, then we can potentially look at long-term outcomes that may not be feasible within an RCT or make it very, very expensive. So I think there are lots of ways to go around it, but I guess administrative data itself has many different challenges on its own, because how do you identify patients with a specific condition when the combinations of billing codes vary widely, or the way people use it vary widely? So
yeah,
I mean, very, very good point. Let me, and I am a little bit cognizant, we have about 9 minutes or so, so I want to be I have a couple of big points that could take a bit longer than that, so I do want to raise them. The first is, it has become, you know, use the word tsunami, but there is a tsunami of trainees and researchers early career using the meta-analysis as the tool that is their research tool of all things, which is, and it used to be the purest, which was, we'll look at the randomized clinical trials and we'll try to pool them, and and we'll move there. And then the purist would say, okay, if it's that, it's not still so great. You'd like to still have a larger study, but we're okay with that. Now it's big saying, well, we pooled every RCT we can possibly pool. Let's move to non-RCT data and let's start pooling case series, and and we're seeing lots and lots of that. What is the journal's general take? And I guess the journal's take is probably somewhat your take, but I'm curious on meta-analysis in general, as in terms of its hierarchy overall and the value of that tool going forward, especially meta-analysis of non-RCTs, I guess.
Yeah, we are pretty strict on our terminology. We call those systematic reviews when they're not pooling data of RCTs, and we're really strict about that. Unless it's a really, really clinically highly relevant question that has never been assessed using such a tool, the chances of that getting through, and it's not me, it's not my policy, it's the policy of the editorial board. There's such problems with those data, bias up the wazoo, that we just feel it doesn't have much place.
So when you're counseling residents or you're counseling, early career researchers, what's your counsel? Is it saying, because it used to be, and I've done it lots. I've done lots of them, but it used to be you do a systematic review with a specific goal, which was, okay, we're going to be using this to plan the next study. We're not going to use it. We have lots of people now, pretty well in the world. I mean, it's probably the most commonest study being promoted right now, and it just becomes a career. Like I'll just do one, okay, and I'll leave it, and I'll do the next one, and then you have a CV of 50 to 100 of these meta-analyses, but they're not going anywhere. Each meta-analysis is a dead end. And I'm just curious, for me, so you kind of see where my bias is, but I'm curious how you're counseling early career researchers and residents.
Yeah, we actually have written an editorial recently in the last 3 years. We won't even look at it if it doesn't have a minimum of 2 randomized control trials of adequate power. We're just not even going to look at it. So my counsel to a young investigator is they need to work with a research librarian, which most major centers have, and find out what's been done. That should be the first step. And it's not done very often. I know, again, Deb Bone works with a lot of residents in designing projects, and that has to be the first task, is understanding what's there in the literature as a first step.
Yeah, okay, that's extremely very helpful. Anyone have any questions before I ask my final question?
Yeah, Mo,
I have one question.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry.
I just wanted you to cover the topic of fragility.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, just really quickly, if you could.
Sure. Okay, you know what? This is something I'm gonna, if I will do the honors to say, Brad, can you speak to fragility?
Yeah.
And if Brad, you're totally happy to dump that on Herman, I'll leave it to you, but.
Thanks very much. The concept of fragility to me was highlighted significantly by Mo and PJ, mainly in small trials with significantly low event rates. There is the concept that if you change one event from one side to the other, you can flip the whole trial. And so if you have an event in one treatment A of event rate of 2 and in a treatment B event rate of 1, but for one person, one loss to follow-up, one missed data set, you can change the concept of the whole trial.
Yeah.
And that happens quite frequently in trials that are very small. Hence the need for really, really large trials, such that you can have multiple event rates. So if you have an event rate of 350 in one group and 250, one event change isn't going to affect the whole trial as it sits out. And I remember sitting in the audience listening to Ms. Gordon or Victor Montori talking about trials that ended early. And trials that ended early, stopped early for benefit, often had smaller event rates, but for you switch one, you can affect the rate of the trial. So fragility to me is exceedingly important in the small trial with very low event rates. And if you've lost any person to follow-up, that one person could have affected the whole outcome of the trial. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, you know, and the challenge is, right, like, so it just gets back to small, right? So then the big question is, how big is big? Like, when don't you have that problem? And that's just the circular argument. So, you know, and I'll just give you an anecdote. So, you know, we did Sprint and way back when in '98, and then that was just over, you know, 1,200 patients or so. And we thought, oh, that's the first, you know, 1,000 patient study. It's great. And, you know, then you'd have someone in the group say, well, they're too small. Okay, so then we do 2,500 patient study. And at that point, someone else says, no, you got to get bigger, right? So at what point do you stop? And now, you know, you're doing several thousand patient studies, and you're looking at really, really small differences, right? I mean, and that's the point. And they have to be very generalizable. They have to be very simple, and they've got to be very easy to do. But the challenge is, if they're too small, people would say, okay, well, part of the problem is that they're small and you have few outcomes. And so one outcome, you know, if you redid the study, it'll be a totally different answer. And we've seen that time and time again. 300 or 400 patient study, you repeat that, you're probably not going to get the same answer, right? You're probably not. And that's a big problem. But then someone else would say, well, what if you do the absolute perfect RCT of 100 patients? People get up all the time and say, and you've done the power test, you talk to your statistician, and you're supposed to get 100 and you've got 100. What's the problem with that? The problem with that, in my mind, was, do you truly believe you have balanced every possible difference between those two patients? So you have 50 patients and 50 patients, and you think they're perfectly balanced. There's just no imbalance in all the possible things that can be different between groups of humans. And it's highly illogical that you won't even get to a balance between, you know, until you get to 1,000, maybe 2,000 per arm, right? You won't get balance. Anyways, you know, those are the challenges that you're debating all the time, thinking, how do you get that? So it gets back to, how do you do stuff fast? Fast meaning efficiently and not collecting. And I know one thing that I know for sure you're a stickler for, Mark, has been, don't collect 40 sheets of paper if you plan on just publishing on one. And we do it all the time, right? Trials get complicated all the time. And those of you who are coordinators, you see these data forms, you're questioning, you know, why are we collecting all this? Yes, yeah, I see Steve looking at me thinking, yep, you know, right? There's a lot of stuff in these studies. But if I can, well, yeah, go ahead, Brad.
No, I was gonna ask a question that's a little bit tangential, but do you think that people are losing faith, orthopedic surgeons or surgeons in general are losing faith in the RCT because calcaneus fractures, proximal humerus fractures, ankle fractures, all of the most recent RCTs show that maybe surgery is not doing anything. But people know that surgery is doing something. Where is that disconnect? Why are these trials showing that surgery isn't, do you know what I mean? Like, where's that disconnect? And you think orthopedic surgeons saying, there's something wrong because I know I'm doing something.
Right, but if you do nothing, they may have the same outcome too, right?
Right, that's right.
Okay, thank you. That's enough.
But that's the loss of faith in the RCT, because the question is the question.
No, Brad, what's happening with you is the RCTs don't meet your belief that you're doing good. That's what's killing you. It's killing you. Killing you. You are very good, Brad. I will tell you right now, you are very good. You do good. Let me ask a question if I could. It's more of a storyline, Mark, is how did you get to editor of JBJS? I mean, you know, for most of us, you know, in training, when you look at journals, you look at the top tier. Was it something that you had decided very early on, and you think about, like, there are moments where you think, oh, you know, that's a really good role. That would be a nice role to have. Or how did it come to be for you?
Yeah, so I started as a reviewer fairly early in my career as an academic, probably even 3 years into surgical practice. And what I think greased the skids, quote unquote, for me is that I did high quality reviews and I did them on time, and I rarely said no. So the numbers of manuscripts keep coming. Basically reviewed for whatever journal wanted me to review, and pretty soon Dr. Cowell from JBJS recommended that I be an associate editor, which means you get even more reviews. Again, on time, high quality. This was in the days when there were paper manuscripts that we used to send back and forth with typewriters. I know you young people don't know what that is, but and then, as I mentioned earlier, Harry, when he was editor before Jim Heckman, recognized that there was this outcomes movement happening in medicine, and I had an interest in some early research. So he asked me to be a deputy editor, and then I did that. I never aspired to be the editor-in-chief, and the only reason why I am is when Vern Tolo, who was after Jim Heckman, decided he'd had enough. Basically, the staff got on the phone with me and said, "We want you to apply." Because I do stuff on time, I respond to emails. You know, I am not super intelligent. I don't have any intellectual gift that, I mean, I'm probably below everybody on the screen right here, but one thing I do is I do it when I say I'm going to do it, and I do it to the best of my ability, and it's persistence, I think. So that's how you get it, I suppose.
Can I ask you
the ability to stand a lot of pain? Because basically, I say I run the complaint department at the journal. When you have 82% rejections, you get a lot of upset people. So I can stand a lot of pain.
I can imagine. Let me ask you this though: how much of your time were you spending? Like when you say that you were doing all these reviews, because I mean, there wasn't like you're really doing it because you're trying to do a service, because there isn't any, there's no other personal gain from that except trying to help the service at the time of being a reviewer. So
no, that's not true. There is personal gain. So if you're a trauma surgeon and you're getting sent orthopedic trauma manuscripts, I got a 1.5 year heads up from the rest of the world on where acetabular fracture surgery was shifting.
That's true. That's true.
It is self-serving to some degree. You really are on top of your field, and you do have that advantage over your colleagues.
That's actually a good point. How much time were you spending roughly, like doing it? Like, I mean, it's probably a ballpark now, but like you said, you're taking on lots and lots. What would that be in a typical month in terms of number of manuscripts? Because I think most people here have probably read or reviewed, and they know how long it takes to do a review.
Yeah, I would, in the early to mid phase of my career, I was probably doing 4 to 5 reviews a month, something like that.
Yep. Yeah, still, that's a considerable few hours a week for sure.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And where do you see yourself? I know I'm just going into a personal life story here, but since we're here, I'm so when you look at the journal, where do you see the journal going? And I'm going to say yourself in the journal, but where do you see the journal's movement? I see the journal breaking up into like a family, more of a family of journals with a platform. Is that the future?
Yeah, well, yeah, I spoke earlier in the conversation about trying to make a clinically useful tool out of case reports, which still is a vision. I think we can achieve that. And I think that would be a real service to the orthopedic community. We have, I think, the best video journal format for the most common surgical procedures, essential surgical techniques. For those of you that haven't looked at those videos, you should. We do not publish anything in that format that doesn't have published outcomes. It's very different than ViewMedi, where you can publish anything. So yeah, so you and I have had this discussion. You know, where I would like to get, Mo, as you know, the others don't know, is to have an app on the phone where we can type in a clinical question and literally get the up-to-date meta-analysis based on the cases that are collated in a way that can be analyzed to ask clinical questions. That's where I want to get.
Yeah.
And
so
hopefully
almost like an auto.
And JBS get there together.
We're close. We're close.
Yep.
And so I see Steve Phillips. You're smiling. You see this guy right here, right in the front, Steve Phillips.
Yeah.
See him smiling. He's smiling because he's on it. He's on it. Yeah. So listen. On that note, we are a bit over time, but I think it was a really, really interesting and fun discussion. I always start by thanking all of you who attended and stayed on video, and I appreciate your comments. You added value, a ton of value to the discussion. I obviously thank Deb for enlightening us a lot with the history. It's kind of nice to hear the history again. Sometimes we forget where we've come and how far we've come. And certainly, Mark, your guidance and all this has been extremely important. And I think there are people that are helping shape orthopedics, and I think you're certainly among that very few individuals. I might leave it to you, if I could, just to maybe say a final closing statement or so.
Well, thanks, Deb, for joining us and for putting that history together. So deeply Canadian, that history, eh?
Totally, totally.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thank everybody for joining in. It's the conversation is what's worthwhile, and I see a lot of faces on there that are going to improve the quality of literature on which we make treatment decisions. So thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your evening, everybody. Take care.